President Donald Trump has been a highly divisive figure, with his wealth being central to his public image. He has long portrayed himself as a self-made billionaire who started with just $1 million loan from his father. However, it turns out that his father, Fred Trump, played a much larger role in his rise to prominence. Fred Trump was a skilled entrepreneur who got into construction after losing his father at a young age. He built his first residential house when he was just 20 years old, and the industry was thriving due to the New Deal's push to encourage residential construction. This initiative provided cheap loans and subsidies that Fred eagerly took advantage of. Over the years, the U.S. government continued to enact housing subsidies, starting with the New Deal, then with military housing during World War II, and finally with the post-war housing boom enabled by the GI Bill. As a result, the American home ownership rate jumped by 20% in just 3 decades, and Fred Trump amassed a fortune largely enabled by the vast sums he received from the government. However, what's interesting is not that he got rich using government money, which is actually quite common. What's noteworthy is that he began a massive campaign of funneling money to his children when he was only 40 years old. He used a range of simple yet effective methods, such as creating a trust whose beneficiaries were his children and donating land to the trust. This meant that he could lease the land back from the trust through a ground lease contract, despite no longer owning it through his construction company. The agreement stipulated that the trust would be paid more than $60,000 annually for the next 99 years, providing a consistent income stream for Donald, who was only 3 years old at the time. However, the land leases were merely the start of Fred's plan, as he gradually began transferring the properties themselves to his offspring over the next 2 decades. He would purchase land through an empty corporation and construct apartments with government funds before donating the corporation's shares directly to his children. This plan was not particularly intricate, and it actually incurred significant gift tax, which Fred seems to have avoided. Upon examining his tax returns, it appears that he paid gift tax on only one of the 8 buildings he transferred in this manner. In 1968, he built one building through a partnership for $2.5 million and gave 15% of the partnership to each of his children a year later. Although the gift tax should have amounted to around $100,000, he only paid $6.5. It's important to note that Fred Trump had a history of underpaying his taxes and had been pursued by the state of New York on multiple occasions in the 1950s and 1960s. Despite these concerns, he had no difficulty receiving millions of dollars in subsidies, most likely owing to his political ties. It was during this time that he undertook his most significant project, Trump Village, for which he received $50 million from the state of New York and which he would later pass on to Donald in questionable circumstances. After graduating from college in 1968, Donald joined his father's company, and the wealth transfer accelerated. In 1972, they formed a partnership to secure an $8 million loan to construct Prospect Tower, and despite the fact that Fred did the majority of the work, most of the earnings went to Donald. In addition to his partnership stake, he received consultancy and management fees as well as all rental revenue from air conditioning. By 1975, Donald was earning over $300,000 each year solely from that building, and when combined with other sources, he had amassed $9 million from his father by the age of 29. Naturally, Fred's objective was not simply to enrich Donald but also to create a public image for him, which would assist him in launching his career. A profile from 1976 reported that Donald had a net worth of $200 million, but it turns out that the projects he was taking credit for were actually his father's. Donald was the president of the Trump Organization at the time, which paid him a generous salary, but he also received numerous loans from Fred. In 1979, Donald received loans totaling $3 million from his father's companies. The loans were structured in a peculiar way. They came with interest, but it was paid back immediately upon receiving the loan, and there was no set repayment plan. This allowed Donald to keep the money indefinitely. As he started his first project in Manhattan, converting the Commodore Hotel into the Grand Hyatt between 1979 and 1980, more loans flooded into his wallet. The same loans were used again when he built Trump Tower between 1980 and 1983. During this time, Fred came up with a scheme to buy off mortgages of at least 14 of his properties and transfer them to trusts, with Donald and his siblings as beneficiaries. Effectively, Donald became his father's banker, receiving interest payments without actually providing mortgage loans. By the end of the 1980s, Nearly $50 million had been transferred to him from his father's empire through various distribution methods. This only encouraged him to take bigger risks, such as buying the Plaza Hotel for over $400 million in 1988 and Eastern Airlines for over $350 million in 1989, which he renamed Trump Shuttle. Most notably, he ventured into the casino business in Atlantic City. Although the story is so expansive that it could be its own video, the key point is that during the early 1990s, as Donald's casinos began to fail, it was Fred who came to the rescue. He provided Donald with millions of dollars to prevent the casinos from defaulting on their debts, allowing them to restructure and gain more time to pay back the loans. During this period, Fred's personal income skyrocketed to $50 million, resulting in a $12 million tax bill. Strangely, he made no significant debt payments or charitable donations, so it's unclear where the money went. To further prop up Donald's businesses, Fred used several tactics. One of his employees purchased $3.35 million worth of casino chips at Trump Castle, then left without betting anything. Additionally, Fred would buy stakes in Donald's properties and then sell them back to him at a loss a few years later. For instance, in 1987, he purchased a 7.5% stake in Trump Palace for over $15 million, but 4 years later, he sold back the entire stake for just $10,000, claiming that the business was failing, even though it was not. Fred's health began to deteriorate in the early 1990s, and he began to show symptoms of dementia. Since he had not yet transferred most of his wealth to his children, he launched an impressive program to transfer everything he had left to them without paying estate taxes before he passed away. In 1992, his children incorporated a maintenance company that immediately became the subcontractor for all of Fred's buildings. As a result, all the millions of dollars that Fred's properties spent on repairs and improvements went through this single company, which incurred a significant markup. Over the next several years, the costs for Fred's empire increased drastically. For example, in Beach Haven, trash compacting services increased in price by 64%, janitorial supplies went up by 100%, and plumbing increased by 120%. By 1994, Donald and his siblings had become the managers of Fred's buildings, further draining cash from his empire. By 1999, Fred's methods had provided each of his children with $2.2 million in income per year. When it came time to transfer Fred Trump's real estate properties, the only concern was the valuation of the buildings. Donald and his siblings enlisted the help of a notorious real estate appraiser who used various methods to bring down the price of 25 apartment complexes with 7,000 units to a mere $40 million. One of the most comical methods used was the calculation of 2 buildings in Trump Village having a negative value. Fred had removed these buildings from an affordable housing program in 1992 to raise rents, but in doing so, he lost a tax exemption that the program had provided. This caused a one-time accounting charge that made the buildings appear unprofitable, even though they were not. In the end, transferring Fred's entire real estate empire cost him $20 million. When Fred passed away in 1999, he had just $2 million in the bank, and his children inherited all of his properties. 5 years later, when Donald's Atlantic City casinos were on the verge of bankruptcy, he convinced his siblings to sell the entire portfolio. In 2004, they sold the empire to a New York City real estate investor for $700 million, officially ending Fred Trump's legacy. Despite his father's immense kickstart, Donald has continued to grow his wealth, with his net worth estimated at around $3 billion today. As for the legality of Fred Trump's tax avoidance methods, the statute of limitations has long since expired, so Donald can only be fined with penalties if they were criminal. It's worth noting that tax avoidance is rampant in New York City, with owners of multi-million-dollar apartments paying as little as 0.017% in property taxes. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks. Stay wise.